Dinesen, I think, is genuinely perverse, and I use that as the highest term of praise. Like, there is something so, I almost want to say kind of severe in her intelligence, that she is so precise in looking at really some of the most kind of uncomfortable aspects of desire. I think that she's one of the great writers of desire.
But also, the ghost story is something that she's really a mistress of.
Yeah.
She was called Karen Blixen, and Isak Dinesen was her pseudonym for writing. And of course, she took a man's name, so there's a double role playing here. And in fact, there's a thread of misogyny in her writing, as there is in Saragossa. But in her case, it's more subtle, more interesting, because she's writing as a woman about women, and her women are incredibly powerful. I mean, The Monkey, the other story that we are going to explore, the prioress is a figure of savage, ruthless power, and so there's an element in which she's talking about her own life. So the decaying aristocrats and the sort of ruined old maids that she's so obsessed with are part of her own story. Though she married, of course, but she got syphilis from her husband.
Yeah, and also
died.
he had. So basically, she wrote these stories in almost like an afterlife. That what happened is that she had many kind of cataclysms happen to her. That her husband gave her syphilis. Although I think at first she had no idea about this, and in fact thought she'd contracted malaria in Africa. She'd owned a farm with her husband, which had failed, so she had to leave.
They couldn't grow coffee at that height.
Yeah, and so basically it failed. She had the great love of her life, Dennis Finch Hatton, but they had also kind of separated just before he then tragically died in a plane crash. And so she came back, aged about 48, to Denmark. So basically her whole life was kind of in ruins. And it's that point that she began to write, and she wrote these 7 stories. I mean, she has this amazing sentence where she says, "Reality had met me such a short time ago in such an ugly shape that I have no wish to come into contact with it again. Somewhere in me a dark fear was still crouching, and I took refuge within the fantastic, like a distressed child in his book of fairy tales. I did not want to look ahead, and not at all to look back."
But the fairy tales are very dark.
Yeah.
So while it may not be maybe a refuge from reality, it's another form of reality, and in which she refracts really strongly, actually, the kinds of troubles that she had.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that the kind of almost, it's fascinating to me that she uses the name Isaac, which is obviously from the biblical story, where Isaac means he who laughs, or the one who laughs, who is the child of Sarah's old age. And so I think there's a very fascinating kind of post-menopausal energy in both the writing of these stories and also in the characters.
In the vision of these extraordinarily powerful
there
figures.
is something about, and it's interesting how often she actually refers to, it's almost as if like she has a kind of now highly kind of gendered idea that essentially seduction can only happen kind of in your youth. But she clearly sees that, as it were, in finally moving away from the world of seduction, women acquire a greater power. And she actually talks about, fascinating, because she was obsessed by the difference between kind of the cultures she'd known in Africa and the European cultures. And she's talking about Africa, she says, all old women had their consolation of witchcraft. Their relations with witchcraft were comparable to their relations with the art of seduction. One cannot understand how we, who will have nothing to do with witchcraft, can bear to grow old.
Yes. So in a way, the prioress in The Monkey
Exactly.
is a kind of compensation, because she's certainly powerful. She's a very malevolent power.
Yeah. So maybe we should, so the story of the monkey, which is probably potentially maybe her most famous story,
It's also the longest. It's almost, it's a novella, really.
Well, I think it's true. Lots of her stories are actually beautifully long. Like they slightly go on longer than you expect. That they, like Potocki, can encompass digression.
Well, her writing is very dense and full of extraordinary detail of furnishings and sensations. Yeah. Do read.
Basically, this is a story about, again, set in the sort of 19th century, so many years before Dinesen, as it were, is writing. And it's clearly there is a disgraced, quite evidently gay young man who is about to be kind of...
And orgies.
and orgies.
Yes.
There's an amazing line about orgies that we must quote at some point, where he has gone to visit his aunt, who is a prioress. And there's a very strange kind of, because it's stated that although this is in the north, in the Lutheran north, there are these places called convents, but are not religious. So she occupies a very strange...
It's a very, very special retirement home.
Yeah, so it's basically a retirement home that looks like a nunnery, but isn't.
But it's no longer religious.
And he goes to see her.
Close to Seven, it's called. Close to Seven.
Close to Seven, yeah, to ask what to do. And to say that, and she says, well, you're going to have to get married. That's the only kind of way you're going to get out of this. And she suggests the daughter of a nearby neighbour, Athena Hotbalahus. And her name, Athena, becomes quite
important. Yes.
important. And there's early on, so the plot, as it were, seems to be about whether he will marry this woman, Athena. Very early on in the story, almost in a throwaway way, we are told that the prioress has a pet monkey, and it looks like a reality effect, as it were. It looks like something that in a normal story would just be a way of characterizing her. So the prioress has a pet monkey, which had been given her by her cousin, Admiral von Schreckenstein, on his return from Zanzibar. So again, we have this exotic, colonizing kind of imagination.
And she gets very restive when the monkey is out.
And so the monkey likes to sometimes, for a few weeks, disappear into the woods. And it was the general opinion, writes Dinesen, that the prioress during these periods would become silent and the victim of a particular restlessness, and she would seem loath to act in the affairs of the house, in which at ordinary times she showed great vigour. And we're told that just as he's arrived, the monkey has gone. And they then have... So basically, Boris is the young man, and he goes to visit Athena to ask to marry her. She basically refuses him.
Very, very solid. I mean, she's an Amazonian.
So she's described as 6 foot, red-headed, very kind of tall and kind of so beautiful, but almost too tall to be sort of still seductive, and clearly far stronger than Boris.
Yes.
And
a woman of her own woman. She's very connected to her father.
She's very connected to her father, and she also loves the French Revolution. She's a Republican.
Yes.
And she, as you say, Dinesen was incredibly learned, but tried to deny this at every point, even though the stories are kind of saturated in literature. And so she actually quotes from Auguste Barbier, a poem to Napoleon, so a kind of romantic French poem eulogizing Napoleon. And he goes back and says to the prioress, well, she
won't have me.
She won't have me. And the prioress then says, well, we'll invite her to dinner. And then essentially you are going to have to seduce her.
Almost more
you gradually
strongly.
realize that if she's going to continue to say no, she's saying you will have to rape her. Because there is then one of the most horrifying sex scenes in literature, I think.
It's quite extraordinary.
Which I think I was thinking of.
I think how this relates to the Gothic is that there is a sense in which they were in a secular sphere. It's not religious. There is a real sense of taint and sin.
Yeah.
And Isak Dinesen really captures that. And it's interesting that she did have syphilis. I mean, it isn't sort of irrelevant, because though she herself was called not a Catholic or anything, she, this idea that you can be poisoned. You can be, and in a way, this is what is happening in this scene too.
Yeah, it's true. And I think it's interesting because not only did her husband give her the syphilis, but her father also died of syphilis. So syphilis is this motif in her life. One of the things, though, that's so seductive about the Gothic is that I think it finds a way of using almost the mythic in contemporary literature. That suddenly in the 19th century or the 18th century or the 20th century that it finds a route back to stories that are so sort of polysemous, as it were, that they are just kind of overflowing with the excessive. And I think that's why it would be a shame. It's not at all that I would disagree that there is a huge, clearly element of historical, political guilt in these, but there is also sexual guilt, there is also personal guilt, and there's also, in Dinesen's case, say, I think, that the Gothic is used, especially in the Seven Gothic Tales, which was her first book, to really express a huge amount of sort of very difficult personal emotion.
She's much, much richer in terms of her language and her sensibility and her psychological astuteness and her willingness to go into very difficult areas of sexual desire.
Yeah.
Very different from, because in Potocki it's pretty standard. I mean, it's pretty standard.
Pretty standard pornography.
Yes. Irresistible sirens appear and minister to young men.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. If you're listening in Apple, you can do that just by going to the top of this podcast, or for Spotify and other podcast apps, go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.